Hi, I'm Ariana Medina. Today I'm going to be speaking about the diagnosis and potential treatment approach of the main character, Nathaniel Avery, from the film The Soloist. From my observations, research, and understanding of the DSM-5, I would diagnose Mr. Avery with schizophrenia. In the film, his behaviors, insights, speech, and cognition all display symptoms of the mental illness. I will now explain more about Mr. Avery through a brief case description and then break down how he meets the criteria for schizophrenia. Mr. Avery is a middle-aged man who is suffering from a severe and persistent mental illness. He was attending Juilliard until his symptoms of hallucinations and paranoia caused him to drop out and return home to the care of his sister. His sister was his primary caregiver until his paranoia caused him to leave her as well. Mr. Avery was living on the streets for over 10 years, often pursuing his love of music with any instrument he could find. He was recently reunited with his sister through a friend, a reporter who wrote stories on him, named Steve. He and his sister are now open to therapy in order to work on their relationship and to help Mr. Avery improve his quality of life. According to the DSM-5, diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia involves the individual meeting specific criteria from 5 different categories. Criteria A from the DSM lists that a person must demonstrate 2 or more items, and it is apparent to me that Mr. Avery exhibits 4 of them. These are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior. From the moment that Steve first encountered Mr. Avery, it was clear that Mr. Avery could not hold a continuous conversation without exhibiting disorganized speech, more specifically, loose associations. It was hard for Steve to even interject to have a dialogue with him at all because Mr. Avery would constantly be speaking any time he wasn't playing his violin. Most of his loose associations would somehow circle back to Beethoven as a subject, as this is a topic that Mr. Avery feels very comfortable speaking about. Mr. Avery also experienced delusions. One of the main ones that was evident in the film was that he viewed Steve as a god figure, and Steve had misused this delusional thinking several times in the film to sway Mr. Avery's thinking and behaviors. Through the flashbacks to his past at Juilliard, I was able to learn of Mr. Avery's hallucinations. This glimpse into the past showed the onset of his symptoms and why he declined in his functioning so quickly. The auditory hallucinations that Mr. Avery experienced caused him to rush off the stage mid-performance during an orchestra practice. He had multiple voices speaking to him at once, telling him what to do, to run, to hide, and so on. These auditory hallucinations were later triggered again when Mr. Avery was given the opportunity to perform on stage, something he was extremely apprehensive about beforehand. The same voices came back to him and told him to leave. I also saw evidence of disorganized behavior, which can include the lack of impulse control. Mr. Avery put his own life at risk to walk out into the highway to remove litter. His impulse to do this was not thought through with any rational need for protecting his safety. He saw some litter and needed to remove it. I did not see any signs of negative symptoms, like a lack of emotional expression. It is noted in literature that negative symptoms may be less obvious to see, and despite taking that into consideration, I still cannot find any to report on. Criteria B says that the symptoms must have interfered with the person's functioning. It's very clear that Mr. Avery has suffered significantly with homelessness, loss of relationships, his dropping out of college, and his inability to even consider pursuing meaningful employment or ways to make a living. His symptoms have taken away his ability to pursue any of these things. The criteria says that symptoms must be continuing over a course of 6 months. It's clear that his delusions, disorganized speech, and disorganized behavior have been persistent over many years. His hallucinations, from what I have observed, seem to be triggered by extremely stressful events. He has had 2 major events where he had experienced auditory hallucinations. The following criteria is ruling out any associated mood disorders or schizoaffective disorder. Mr. Avery does not seem to show signs of any mood disorders. He does experience pretty severe anxiety and paranoia. However, he does not seem to have any major mood swings or drastic up and downs in mood that could signal a mood disorder such as depression, bipolar, or schizoaffective disorder. He's generally pretty content, which leads me to believe that this is schizophrenia rather than a mood disorder with psychotic features or schizoaffective disorder. In order to get a final diagnosis of schizophrenia, Mr. Avery does need to be seen by a physician in order to rule out any medical conditions that could be causing these symptoms. Once it's declared that he's in good health, or at least that there's no underlying physical conditions that are causing the symptoms, a diagnosis of schizophrenia can be made. This has already taken a huge toll on Mr. Avery's life. It's often considered in literature to be a severe and persistent mental illness. However, the course of the illness can vary from person to person and can be dependent on what treatment is available to them. Some people do experience periods of remission, relapse, and multiple episodes of symptoms throughout their life. According to the DSM, one of the features of schizophrenia may be a lack of insight. This means that the person may not know or understand that they have a mental illness that is causing them symptoms. This is different than a defense mechanism because it is actually part of the illness itself. This may make it very difficult for individuals to gain necessary treatment and support and to stick with any treatment that they do receive. People often wonder how individuals get schizophrenia. According to Smith and Siegel, authors of HelpGuide.com's resource for schizophrenia, the illness has a strong link to genetics. People with a first-degree relative with the illness have a 10% chance of getting it themselves. However, this is only one small piece of the puzzle, as 60 people with schizophrenia do not have any blood relatives with it. It has also been shown that an abnormal brain structure and early exposure to high levels of stress, either while in the womb or during later development, can have a serious impact on the acquiring of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia affects all aspects of a person's life, as was evident with Mr. Avery. According to Smith and Siegel, it can cause a disruption in daily activities and daily living skills, problems with substance abuse, an increased risk for suicide attempts, and problems with interpersonal relationships. Schizophrenia may also take a serious toll on family members and others who are close to the person. For example, it was difficult for Steve to have any sort of friendship with Mr. Avery because of his inability to hold a conversation, but Steve did try. Family members are often caregivers for the person who's diagnosed. According to AMFT's page on schizophrenia, the systemic effects often leave family members having to cope with social stigma, the mental health system itself, increased stress, caregiver responsibilities, and their own emotional distress. According to Dr. Marsh, in an AMFT clinical update called Understanding Schizophrenia, he stated that families seeking therapy with individuals with schizophrenia generally need information, skills, and support the most. In order to best support Mr. Avery and his sister during the family therapy treatment process, as their therapist, I would most likely use narrative therapy in my approach with them. A family-based approach would best benefit Mr. Avery and his sister, as they are recently reunited and both need to learn how to navigate their roles as siblings and her role as a potential caregiver. I feel a narrative therapy would be the best fit for them because Mr. Avery needs to own his story and recreate it from his own viewpoint. Mr. Avery spent months of his life having his story told by Steve and other media sources, but now it is his time to express himself in his own words and shape a new ending to his story. Mr. Avery needs to feel in control and able to make his own choices. Providing him with the ability to share his experiences and his perspective and decide how he perceives his reality is going to be crucial to improving his quality of life and lessening the impact of his symptoms. In my treatment plan for the family, I would start the initial phase of therapy building rapport with my clients. I would get to know them both apart from the schizophrenia. I'm sure Mr. Avery would tell me much about his passion for music, particularly Beethoven, and what inspires him to play. I would take into consideration Mr. Avery's loose associations that may make holding a conversation difficult. I would use interventions, such as identifying dominant discourses that Mr. Avery and his sister have about the way the world sees him. Another important aspect of the initial phase is to identify treatment goals, which Mr. Avery may struggle to do at first, given his potential hesitations about treatment in general and his lack of insight. In the initial part of treatment, I'd also work on encouraging Mr. Avery to see a medical doctor for a physical assessment and provide him with a referral or directions on how to access a doctor when he's ready. Working phase tasks of my treatment plan would consist of continuing to build and maintain. One goal would be to decrease Mr. Avery's anxiety about trusting his sister again. Interventions I would use would be mapping unique outcomes and continuing to decrease dominant discourses. Another goal in the working phase of treatment would be to increase his sense of agency. One approach to continue to increase Mr. Avery's sense of agency and to possibly help Mr. Avery sort out his disorganized thoughts would be to use writing. This medium could be tried to see if it would help him be able to process more organized thoughts on paper. And the approach that I would use would be an open journal. An open journal is a form of a continuous dialogue between therapist and client, and it could be used to help increase rapport. It would be another form of self-expression besides Mr. Avery's music, and could be another avenue in which Mr. Avery can express and process his experiences. There was a case study by Schneider, Austin, and Arney in which an individual with schizophrenia used an open journal where both her and her therapist took turns writing and having an ongoing conversation through the journal that could then be discussed in person if the client did so choose. If writing helps Mr. Avery have more organized thoughts, I believe this could be worth a try during the working phase of therapy. It gave the individual in the study an increased sense of agency and could help build rapport and trust between me and Mr. Avery by demonstrating my increased interest and respect for Mr. Avery's written thoughts. Closing phases of treatment would consist of developing a plan for moving forward after treatment ends and maintaining previous goals. Specific goals to focus on would be solidifying the new narrative that Mr. Avery and his sisters are creating and increasing Mr. Avery's support system. One particular intervention to use during this time could be a ceremony to celebrate Mr. Avery and his sister's completion of narrative family therapy treatment. I believe that using narrative family therapy as an approach to help Mr. Avery and his sister have a successful relationship and decrease the effect of Mr. Avery's schizophrenia symptoms will hopefully be beneficial for their new relationship, and it will also allow Mr. Avery to continue to make strides forward in his life.